Okay. Hi, everyone. Hello. Thank you for the call and response. Welcome to the panel entitled GIS in Education, a tool to increase social justice advocacy and action. Before we get started, usually like to do a roll call in terms of who's in the space. So if you feel comfortable identifying, how many students do we have in the space? Okay. All right. All right. How about staff? All right, awesome. What about faculty? All right, all right. And then community members. Do we have community members here in attendance? Okay, all right, wonderful. At your tables, you should have a paper with a QR code, 2 QR codes on them, that you can scan for more information on the panelists and the moderators. It includes the bios as well as the questions that will guide today's conversation. Before we launch in, we do want to just kind of work through very quickly some working agreements. And so for this session, and before we dive into conversation, we collectively acknowledge that it's vital to co-create a space of community and hold one another accountable in our teaching and learning, ensuring that we are present, listening for shared meaning, lifting every voice, and operating from a frame of mutual respect. That while we assume good intentions, we also acknowledge that there's a reality that exists between intention and impact, and in so doing, we're very mindful in our communication to and with one another. In this space, we're a community of learners, and we're willing to be surprised and grapple with ambiguity. We refrain from withholding energy as we want to give voice to our flat-footed truths in ways that lead us into shared envisioning and new ways forward. So if you will, if you agree to our community agreements, on the count of 3, I would like you to shout, Ashe. 1, 2, 3. Ashe. Ashe is a Yoruba word that means power, and we know that words have power to bring actions to fruition. So with that, we're all in agreement as we dive into this conversation. So I would like to start with an introduction of the moderators, and I'll pass it to Jen first.
Hi, I'm Jen Bierke. I'm a doctoral student here in the Educational Leadership Program, and I'm a professor of geography and GIS at San Bernardino Valley College.
Hi, my name is Eddie Partida, and I am assistant professor in the College of Education.
Hi, my name is Annie Danis, and I'm an assistant professor in anthropology in the Department of Geography and Anthropology here at Cal Poly.
Hi, my name is Guillermo Douglas Jaimes. I'm an assistant professor in environmental analysis at Pomona College, just down the way.
Hello, my name is Socorro Morales, pronouns she, her, and ella, and I'm an assistant professor in educational leadership here in Cal Poly Pomona.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Karen Katie Harris Terrell, and I represent the community-based organizations. I represent, as the executive director, a social impact organization called Let's Talk LD, and we serve neurodivergent learners. And I'm also finishing my last few months of doctoral study here at Cal Poly Pomona in the Educational Leadership Program.
Thomas Tan, I'm the Executive Director of Technology Services of School District. Been doing that for like 38 years or so, and I'm also adjunct faculty out of the School of Public Administration and Education here at Cal Poly.
And greetings again, everyone. My name is Janelle Pitt-Parker, and I serve as the Dean of the College of Education Integrative Studies here at Cal Poly Pomona. Thank you so much for being here and joining us in this conversation. Thank you. So we are going to get started with our first question, and this is addressed to all panelists. As you reflect on today's theme, which underscores the intersection of GIS, education, and social justice, what is one hope, desire, or learning outcome you have for individuals in attendance today. And Dr. Partida, if we can start with you.
So one learning outcome is to maybe expand our sense of what's possible with GIS for novices. In other words, for non-technical folks, and looking at how you can use GIS to really look into issues that are important to you and to the communities that you serve.
Thank you. That's a great one. I'll add to that a better understanding of how porous the edges of GIS are. I think sometimes we get focused into the technologies and the platforms that we're using, but I hope you leave here with an understanding of how GIS can be paired with other modes in learning and social justice activism.
So, one thing that I love the idea that GIS is becoming more expansive. I always think about it as an expanding universe. And I love that there are more and more tools that make it easier and lower the bars to entry. And at the same time, we need to slow down because these tools are getting so fast and so quick, and they're making things look so slick that, as the previous presenter noted, we need to be very thoughtful with how we're presenting our data so that we can be truthful, and also that we orient our maps and our mapping tools towards creating that more socially and ecologically just world.
I think one of the things that I'm excited about just when we're talking about these different forms of technology and how we utilize them is really thinking about how people continue to push the boundaries of what they can do and how we can use them and how we can make sense of our everyday, right? And our everyday particularly situated around different forms of oppression, and how do we make sense of that in our lived realities. And so continuing to push the boundaries of what does space mean, how is space socially constructed, right? And what are the ways that folks are contributing to expanding our conceptions of that.
There's an old saying that even the best tools are useless in unskilled hands. And in the work that I do, it's really important to center the voices of the historically oppressed communities that I serve, particularly people with disabilities. So it's my hope that as we really expand the use of these tools, we recognize how important it is that we put these tools in the hands of people in the communities that they're designed to serve. I think it's important for communities to develop the skills for constructing knowledge where the needs of their community are centered, and the community ultimately should be determining what information is most meaningful for learning, growth, and social change.
With GIS, you have another way of expanding your population in terms of how we can consume information. It's just not restricted to technology people, but as we saw, the parts about making data and information functional, but also enlightening for folks. GIS offers that way to bring people on board, and they don't have to have a GIS degree. In doing so, we expand our population of people who can join us and understand and engage in the conversations we need to have.
Thank you. Our next question. GIS holds the power to examine historical patterns, analyze layers of data, and visually frame organizational and societal opportunities for engagement and action. What are some critical conversations that GIS can support us in having in educational and community spaces that bridges past, present, and future contexts and moves from problematizing individuals and communities to critically interrogating systems and systemic issues? Our main respondents will be Dr. Danis and Dr. Harris-Terrell.
So for me, again, I work with people with disabilities, and a persistent theme in the work that I do is access. And so access to GIS tools, in my opinion, need to be democratized, and they need to also ensure that they're accessible to broad spectrum of population, particularly those people that may not necessarily have, that have accessibility challenges. I think it's important that we offer revelations that focus the gaze on the interactions between power and power distribution and policy making. And it's also important that ethical considerations guide how these tools are used. I was, in preparation for this panel, I read an interesting insight provided by the UK Statistics Authority. They published a paper entitled Ethical Considerations in the Use of Geospatial Data for Research and Statistics. And they stated there is a danger that geospatial data and how it's analyzed can reflect inherent biases about location and equally can influence how findings of a project are interpreted. So I think that it's very important to really appreciate how important it is to ensure that as the previous speaker indicated, the information that's being reflected is reflecting the accuracy of the communities that the data is centered on.
Wonderful, thank you for that. Again, I'm Dr. Danis. I'm in the Geography and Anthropology department here at Cal Poly. And I wholeheartedly ascribe to what you just said, so I'll build on it with a bit of an anecdote from my own research and teaching. So part of my training is as an archaeologist, and I do community-based research, which means I work with folks in the story I'm going to tell in northern New Mexico to use the skills I know as an archaeologist, that is looking at traces of the past to create meaning and to understand how the past influences the present. And I work with communities to understand their needs and bring resources and those expertise to those communities. So some folks I work with are in El Pueblo de Abiquiu in northern New Mexico, kind of between Albuquerque and Santa Fe, if anybody's familiar. And they're folks who are Janisoro, which means their ancestors in the 1700s were indigenous people from a bunch of different tribes that were captured or sold into indentured servitude in Spanish households. So over the last couple hundred years, they have kind of moved between different racialized ethnic identities. And one of the big issues that they have are around land and water rights. And this is a really common theme for indigenous people everywhere, especially in the high desert of northern New Mexico. So I show up and I'm brought into the community by my mentor, and I do work for other people's projects with the community to learn and learn and learn. And it turns out that maps have damaged the community's right to land. So this community's been there for 200 years, and it wasn't always the United States. The United States comes in, and a surveyor creates a map that takes away a couple 100,000 acres of their land. And the map is the thing that gets honored, not their experience of the landscape, not where their irrigation ditches are, not where they run their sheep, right? So this community already knows about maps. They know about the power of maps. I don't need to tell them that. They, feel this challenge already. And the way that I'm able to use GIS with this community is to map traces of the past landscape and overlay it onto not just the present landscape, but also the landscape that this community knows they have connection to. So I'm trying not to limit myself to just those data sets that I already have access to from the state engineer, for example, right? That shows the official boundary of the landscape. I want to create data sets with this community that accurately reflect how they experience the world. So one of these conversations becomes, who creates those shapefiles that we use in GIS? And how do we use the tools that we know to engage communities in not just using the data that's already out there, but creating their own, which starts a really important conversation, like we heard, about the power of maps, the rhetoric and the narratives that they can write. So kind of building off that with that little anecdote about some work that I've done in the past.
Yeah, if I could add, I think it's so powerful what you're saying, and I think one of the biggest challenges that we face is that for many historically minoritized populations, there's just not completeness in terms of the type of data that's collected. So again, you know, for instance, when you're looking at research on people with disabilities, it may be characterized and generalized. People with hidden disabilities, such as specific learning disabilities, may be included with research on people with physical disabilities. These communities face very different challenges, and of course, within the population of people with invisible disabilities, there's autism, there's ADHD, and there's dyslexia, and all of this other, you know, types of disabilities that reflect different challenges. And so I think that, you know, one of the challenges that I've experienced in my work is really making sure, as we try to connect resources to the people that need the resources, we have to really deepen our understanding, and we need to enrich these data sets in meaningful ways to ensure that we're providing more complete pictures of not only populations, but what the needs of the population are.
I think we have 1 more minute if any other panelists would like to weigh in on that critical engagement or opportunities for working with communities. Okay.
Just add one little thing. I think within that context, you know, so I do research with folks in Rio and in the favelas. These are informal settlements in slum communities. And there's tension because there are some folks for whom being mapped puts them in danger.
Yes.
And for others, being mapped puts them on the map and gives them access to resources. And so this is very fraught because there isn't a one-size-fits-all approach, and it requires that dialogue with the community, and not just like hand-picking, but, you know, really a commitment to working with the community and ensuring that what we're doing is not just aligning ourselves with the people who are in power, who have put folks in these oppressed or marginalized positions.
Excellent, excellent. I'm gonna do my best to refrain because the dialogue is heating up and you all are bringing the fire here. So as we think about this next question, GIS helps us to understand people and communities through space, time, and location, and provides a platform for us to reflect on how we encounter physical spaces and negotiate racial, ethnic, gendered, and sociopolitical boundaries. May you provide examples of GIS strategies that you've used to engage students, parents, families, and/or communities in critical conversations, advocacy, and social action, specifically in relation to health equity, community resilience, and educational policy and decision-making. And our main respondents for this question will be Drs. Douglas Hymas and Dr. Tan.
All right, so yeah, you know, so one of the things I've done is I've worked with folks in Rio during the pandemic, and we were mapping COVID cases. So this is really challenging work. You know, the folks who I got to work with had access to smartphones or internet so we could participate via Zoom. But it was really heartbreaking to hear folks describing the way that they were living through the pandemic. And if you're not familiar with Brazil, it's the country that received more enslaved Africans than any other country in the Western Hemisphere. Something like 6 million enslaved Africans were sent there, which in comparison, the United States received about 500,000, almost 600,000. So it really just kind of highlights that there's deep history of anti-Blackness that exists. And so when I'm in these conversations and we're trying to map these cases, because the government data doesn't have the same granularity to reflect the realities that folks in these communities were seeing, were experiencing, were feeling. And you know, we had partnered with other folks who were giving us some of the data that did exist, and then highlighted that the deep disparity of Black and mixed Brazilians who were impacted and dying of COVID. And folks using terms like genocide to describe their experience, which is, it's really, you can imagine I'm in my home and I just shut my laptop down when I'm done. So this ways of thinking about mapping it really goes deeper than just putting a point on the map. Although the point on the map is really powerful, because with these folks who were not seeing their reality reflected, you know, knowing that they were experiencing something that was being hidden in the media, whether it was intentional or not, the data did not conform to their reality. And so by doing these projects that allowed folks to actively collect data from their communities, place them on this dashboard, which many of you may have seen, a COVID dashboard of sort, and to start placing that. And it got us to think critically, because one of the other challenges came in is the unevenness of data in this metro region. So we're in the LA region, we're in LA County, this is the city of Pomona, we know we're in greater Los Angeles. We have data that, you know, we can look at the region and we can talk about things, but the city of Rio de Janeiro is so dominant and has a huge statistical arm from their city government, but the neighboring suburbs don't have that. And so when we're doing this collaboration of folks from these favela communities, and they're seeing that there's still gaps of data because they just don't have state data for their communities. And so highlighting the kind of needs that we still have is like, when we're thinking about, you know, we live in urban regions, and yet we don't have an urban regional data. So how do we actually, you know, fill those gaps? Anyway, I won't take too much time, but.
As we consider GIS in involving communities in critical conversations, a recent example from my experience working in school district was with the passage in 2002 of the California Voting Rights Act. In that act, it made it easier for minority groups to prove their votes were being diluted in at-large elections. So what that means is, in the whole district, for example, the vote of the minority could be diluted because of the volume of the other is just a minority vote. So the remedy to this was that minority voters could sue local governments or boards of education to eliminate these at-large elections. The remedy for this was the solution called trustee areas. So we'd take what was before the whole district and then divide it into trustee areas. And they're very specific about how they did that. You might be familiar with the concept of gerrymandering, where people say, well, you know, all my friends over here, so I'm gonna make this weird squilly. No, they're very conscious of that. GIS comes into play here. The example I saw was when I was with the High San La Plata Unified School District, and all school districts went through this, because if they didn't, they would get sued. Demographer came in using GIS, and they would feed the, I think it was ArcView, trustee areas. They designed them, but no gerrymandering, so it had to be equal in population. So not 100 here, 2,000 here, but so you had to draw it equal population. Also, they considered using credible data for federal and state equality, using the latest data at the time was 2020 census data. They were also able to use CAVA data, voter registration data, to see where people were at. So with that combination of feeding this is where the GIS comes into play. They were able to take into account variables: ethnicity, gender, income, visual and natural boundaries. The application of this is, once the demographer made the maps, we had at least 5 community meetings, and people could come up to the map and say, oh, you know, this river here, that's really the natural break. We ought to make the boundary here. With that input, the demographer was able to go back, taking the input from the community, and redesign maps that satisfied the needs of CAVA, but also met the needs of the community and in their involvement. So.
And are there any additional panelists wishing to provide any follow-up on that question?
I just want to follow up on how you're speaking about sort of the back and forth, or like iterative design of these voting districts, with sort of a prompt for you future GIS leaders out there, which is to engage these multiple modalities of your maps. And that's an access issue, like we talked about in the previous question too, of, you know, bringing those district maps to a table where someone can draw all over them, right? And destroy your beautiful design with their lived reality. So in the example that I spoke about before, I was creating very technical GIS data for the state engineer of New Mexico, who knows what GIS data is, in order to help support community water rights. But that didn't really have much meaning to the people I was working with, except for my community interns who were being trained at the same time. So it was really important for me to build into this process a way for my community members to express that same GIS data in a different way. And so they decided that they wanted to create a zine, right? Which is not where you see GIS data. That's a handmade magazine that went in the rural library, for free for their friends, basically. And so we had to work between pairing the insights that this big model of their land could give us and the authoritative power those have for the state engineer with some other modes of expression of what that data meant, by making literally collages out of printouts out of the GIS maps. And that's not what I expected, right? So that openness to bringing that data into multiple modalities, I think, is something else for you who will be in charge shortly.
I was going to add that I think that in working with communities, being able to visualize this data is so critically important when you're trying to figure out how to suss out what a particular issue is that's faced by a community, and then also how you kind of deliberate how to address the problems that need to be solved within a community. And I think that, again, that accessibility piece is so huge. It's making sure that, this information, the data is in the hands. As a CBO, we have to work really grounded in impact. And impact for us means in what ways are we able to inspire and engage communities to identify problems within their communities and solve them. And so by having access to this information, I think it's incredibly empowering. And then communities, I know in the particular case of our organization, we're able to connect communities to funding resources to address environmental issues within their community, accessibility issues within their community. In addition to that, we're also able to build community partnerships with schools and specific affinity group organizations that are designed to encourage collaboration. We've used the tool, GIS tool specifically to drive a participatory action research, which is so critically important to, again, centering the voices of the communities you're trying to serve and ensuring that they really have an opportunity to make determinations about what the data is that they consider to be valid and specific to their community and their community's needs, and what information does not necessarily, as indicated earlier, necessarily representative of some of the challenges or information where the data may be skewed.
Is it on? And if you all are feeling resonating differently stated sentiments that the panelists are providing to you, we appreciate the call and response, the finger snapping, the amens, all of it. So feel free and welcome. So, Jen.
Thank you. So our next main respondents will be Dr. Morales and Dr. Partida. Research has underscored the benefits of GIS to promote critical thinking and consciousness building. Can you discuss some ways you have leveraged GIS in classrooms research, or in partnership with communities to examine the historical and contemporary issues of inequality, inequities, and everyday forms of racism in K-12 education, community colleges, and/or higher education?
In 2.5 minutes. Raise your hand if you identify as a data point. Neither do I. I have dedicated the last 15 years of my career preparing teachers, and more specifically, preparing teachers that have the knowledge, skills, and habits of mind to disrupt persistent inequities in schools. And it turns out that the knowledge and skills are easy. Those are really well defined. We know what students or future teachers should know. We know the knowledge, the theories, the practices that they should engage in. What's really difficult or much harder is to change mindsets. And our teachers come in with all the great intentions in the world to do good and to become the types of teachers that they think their students deserve and students do deserve. And many still hold on to negative or deficit-based narratives about their students, about the communities that the students come from. And a lot of these narratives come from data, right? We talk about achievement gaps. We talk about disparities in test scores. We talk about how far learning loss. Everything in education is framed through a negative or a deficit lens, which kind of just perpetuates this narrative, right? Or this negative narrative about what our students are capable of, what they deserve, or what our communities are. And so one of the ways that we've tackled this challenge of changing teachers' mindsets is if we can get teachers to see themselves not as individuals who are trying to save students from their communities or their circumstances, but rather have teachers see themselves as embedded as integral parts of their communities, right? As parts of an ecosystem, of an ecology within their schools and their community that nurture and cultivate the brilliance that students already have, not in spite of, but because of where they come from and who they are. So one way that we have done this is through asset mapping, community asset mapping, which is having teachers go out into their communities that they serve, learning about what assets the community has to offer, and those are the stories. Those are not data points, those are stories, those are individuals, those are the abuelitas, abuelitos, those are the musicians, those are the activists, those are the elders in the community. And going out and where are these individuals, right? And how do they relate to space and time and place? And telling those stories. So those maps can be, they can be GIS maps, right? And we can collect some of that data, but we can also use story maps, which is a feature of GIS that is a more visual and narrative way of collecting data. Because if we're saying, as Jonathan pointed out, that the map is the source of truth, whose truth are we talking about, right? So we use story maps as a way to engage teachers in creating those counter narratives, collecting those stories, and really seeing the community and cultural wealth that's already there in their communities.
Thank you for that, Dr. Partida, and to everyone that's been sharing about this. I think I'll share a few things that kind of zoom out, but kind of point to some of the similarities that folks have talked about. So GIS, right, like other forms of data points, are still ultimately interpreted, right? And I think that's really, as much as people have been emphasizing, it's actually extremely key because we know, right, that narratives inform institutions and structures, right? So if we have deficit narratives about communities, then we create those institutions that don't support them, that don't provide, right, or see their assets or the wealth of knowledge. And so we just kind of go in this cyclical process between those two parts. And so I think that seeing GIS, right, as data and information, that gives us some very important points to consider, and at the same time doesn't tell the complete picture, right? And I think, you know, Eve Tuck, who's a Indigenous scholar from Canada, right, and kind of works with youth, talks a lot about how do we move away from damage-centered research. It is important, for example, to know, right, where our low-income communities are, where folks have been redlined, right? That information is important, but if that's the only picture that we paint, then we continue to see those communities in that light, right? We see them as deprived of resources, right, and deprived of epistemologies that we should highlight and validate. And so I think, to your point, Dr. Partida, really looking at what is beautiful about these communities, right, and really complexifying that narrative, as you also shared, right, like what are the contradictions and the complexities of what data is showing, and what is our responsibility in response to that, right, and how do we interrogate our relationship to that and our relationship to the narratives that we're telling using these data points, right, and engaging the community in these different ways. Some of the work that I've done with youth has been around, and I'm I work primarily, or have worked primarily with elementary aged youth, and really looking at how do physical markers create and shift spaces, right? And the youth know, like they know where the good schools are. They know where the bad schools are, right? They know which freeway divides what and what it means. And so really, I think building upon people's everyday material realities and how they're making sense of space and their relationship to and within space, and how do we then highlight, right, not only their sort of capacities to really theorize and do high theory and, you know, kind of disrupt this idea that only the academies for high theory, but also really thinking about, okay, and what is it about those communities that the maps are not telling us right now? Yeah. Right, that we really do need to highlight and show to kind of really complexify this picture and kind of not just frame these communities in the same sort of deficit approaches and ways.
Thank you. Do we have one or two other panelists who would like to take a minute and add or weigh in? Please.
I can share one other thing. So one of the projects, you know, the COVID project was a very heartbreaking project to work on, very needed work. But one of the things that came out of that, or was actually, that was what caused the pause, because we were trying to map these sustainability initiatives in favelas in Rio de Janeiro. And so there's over 1,000 favelas, and we were able to map 121 initiatives that range from community gardens, community solar plants, biodigesters to treat you know, sewage, recycling projects, and all these sorts of things. And one of the things that we were doing with this project was to actually show, again, shifting that narrative around these communities, because oftentimes news about these favelas is centered in violence, it's centered in poverty, it's centered in crime. And so by being able to show these projects existing, one of the features with this map was that we had it to be dynamic. So we could actually included information that folks could search, such as who the leadership was. And one of our questions was, which projects were led by women? And we did an assessment of the map, and one of the folks who was part of this project, she actually mentioned that she sat and looked at the map and actually was using that tool to filter by which projects were led by women, because she saw that as a potential to interact with other women who could serve as mentors for her. And it was just such a powerful moment when you just see what it means to see yourself on the map, what it means to feel like you're seen. Another community is just talking about that they saw their community, their little pin on that spot where they are, and that they could share that with others who are potential collaborators, and the pride that they took in being able to show that they're on the map. And so I think that's one aspect when we think about mapping, you know, we're not data points, and how do we connect those stories of real people whose real lives are reflected there, and just the potential for so much good that can come out of that.
So critical. Thank you. Yes.
Yeah, I was just thinking, you know, in the population that I work with, they so often don't see themselves represented in research. They don't see themselves represented even, and spatiality is huge in disabled spaces. You know, it speaks directly to physical access, other types of access, but it also speaks to spaces where there's inclusion and belonging. And so, a lot of the work that we're really looking to do with the community that we serve is how do we try to create mapping around, counter spaces and safe spaces where, for instance, if you're transitioning to college, you're a high school student and you're neurodivergent, where are those places in the country that are going to be welcoming for you, that are going to be supportive communities for you? And again, I think it's incredibly empowering for students to be able to look at, these maps and look at this data, and not only look at where resources may or may not be, but also make some decisions about, is the data representing me intersectionally? Right, which is oftentimes really lost, I think, in research and data in general. And I think that particularly within the neurodivergent community, looking across intersections of, LGBTQ, whether you have an additional physical disability, are you a person of color? In what ways do access to information, access to resources, shape your existence, and how can you change that? Again, I think the purpose of GIS, in my opinion and in my work, is really to create a space for developing very deep conversations with the communities you serve and helping them or facilitating conversations where they can start thinking about in what ways can this data serve me.
Yes. As we say goodbye to a few of our students who are here, we hope you take on GIS one of these days. Technology is powerful, and we need you.
Ooh, this is fire. I'm ready to take a class with all of you. So we're at our final question, and this question is addressed to all panelists. Given what we have discussed so far, and as you think about ways to center student voice and really amplify epistemologies of all students, including students of color in K-12, community colleges, and university spaces, please share with us your thoughts on education journey mapping, promoting safety in learning environments, and your message to institutions that vow to support student success.
I'll just go back to what has been discussed previously on the panel, and that is really the power of narrative. I think the previous speaker spoke to that, but I think particularly for historically oppressed people, when your story is not told, when you're not represented, it's really important to be able to access tools and be able to leverage those tools to tell your story. And so I think, the story mapping, as the professor mentioned, is so critically important, and it's so empowering for students, because for many, in the case of, again, the population I serve, for neurodivergent students sitting in classrooms, they often are sitting at the margins, and it's rare that their lived experience is centered in the classroom ecosystem. And so for educators to really create that space for students to discover more about themselves as they're navigating their identity formation across all of their intersections, really connecting the dots through story mapping and, and the narrative features of GIS, I think are really critically important.
I'll go ahead and build on that. Thinking about safety in the classroom and using GIS as a tool prompted me to think a lot about the kind of data that I provide as an educator when I'm using GIS as a container for some conversation, and the importance of listening, which was something I kind of heard throughout our whole conversation in terms of communities. But if we think about the classroom community, making GIS activities that are based on listening to what your students not just are interested in, but experience, so that the data you're providing doesn't sort of foreclose right away on certain experiences, because so much of the data that we can easily access out there is racialized, is classed, is sort of put into demographic buckets already. And so thinking of ways that you can set up GIS activities that either prepare students or give opportunities to create other data sets. And I think I started with this too, but the creation of the data itself, not just the manipulation or the analysis of it, is a crucial opportunity in using GIS in a classroom setting, sort of to encourage safety.
I was looking at some of the projects in the back there, and I think one of the parts that we talked about using GIS to broaden a deeper conversation. As you look at the GIS, those maps and the designs, it's not so much knowledge to an end, but it's the beginning of knowledge. It opens the door for people to learn and have a conversation. The interpretation isn't absolute. And that opening to get that deeper knowledge and have, what does that mean to you? How do you see that? I think it goes a long way to not just the static tables and pie charts we've been used to. So now the ability to develop a skill and having us to work together, I think, is an added cherry on top in that, and getting us to all work together and be a community. So
if I can add my, so I teach Intro to GIS class at Pomona College, and so it used to be called Intro to GIS. And after a few years, I finally was like, no, what is it I'm trying to do? And so I've renamed it as Just GIS, and there's an exclamation point. It's actually a factorial. and the subtitle is An Introduction to a Social and Ecologically Justice-Oriented Geographic Information System. Yes. And the point of it, it's a mouthful because I want you to slow down. I want you to think critically about what we're trying to do. And so what I do in the classroom is there's a few things. I recognize that we all show up with so many different assets, so many different abilities. And we also have had different levels of exposure to these various tools. Like, I've met some students who did a GIS project in elementary school, and I'm like, I didn't touch it until my master's program. So it's just the amount of access to these tools has just shifted. And so what I think about that is, how do we create a space where we are a community of learners, where we recognize that each of us bring something that we can share and teach others, and that we can create a supportive community that rewards the struggle and shares what that struggle is so we can all learn and grow. And so those are the ways that I think that we need to be mindful, is because too often, these kind of technical skills fields end up being like, well, did you have your math? Did you have your physics? Did you have your computer science? And it creates a barrier to who can enter into the field. And we know that it is absolutely critical that we have a diverse set of people and life experiences in that room, so when we produce the maps that are going to shape the world, that we do it ethically with the eye towards justice.
Be critical. This is a conversation that is about GIS, but in general, we can apply what we just talked about to any new technology, whether it's AI, whether it's anything else, right? Is when we are looking for solutions in the technology, when we're looking for solutions to really important questions, and in this case, we're really looking at questions of racial equity, of systemic oppression. It's really important for us to ask whose data, whose voice, who's being centered, who's not being included, and message to institutions or instructors or community members is really do the work to ask the questions and include all the folks who are impacted the most by the problems that you're trying to solve. Be critical and look carefully and ask those questions, regardless of the technology, and in this case, especially with GIS.
And kind of the last thing I'll add to just kind of build on what everyone was saying is, I think one of the things that folks have been really reiterating is being critical, right, and being really reflective of your relationship to maps and data and community spaces. But also continue to push, like, what don't we know yet, right? And how do we not yet know it? And, when we're talking about these topics that can be very painful and traumatic, right? When we're talking about, loss of life or COVID or other things that are happening in the world, I'm always, in kind of drawing from women of color feminists, I'm always interested in what does joy look like? What does resilience look like in this world, right? And in these ways. And so, me personally, I'm interested in how do we document and show and maintain joy, and what people do to maintain and keep community in light of these kinds of issues, because those are the histories that have been sort of lost, right, and forgotten. And so how do we keep an eye to what do we know, what do we not know yet, right? And how can we continue to really question what that is and why it would be important to think about sort of the absence of some of these things.
I just wanted to add that I think that colleges and universities have a very specific role that they need to be playing in ensuring that these tools are accessible to members of their community. And I just think, this community of practice, in my mind, needs to develop, where colleges and universities are making commitments to ensure that, people, particularly people who are not represented in these data sets, whose the fullness of their stories have not been heard. I think it's important for colleges and universities to make sure that they're creating seminars and other types of community events and public outreach that's designed to deepen the understanding of these tools and how these tools can be liberatory right, in the end. And they can really inform the practice and coalition building and movement building within communities.
If we can give our panelists a round of applause, please, enthusiastically. And co-moderator, Jen B., thank you. And a round of appreciation for, this is a graduate student, Allison Cisco, who is our Director of Finance for SACE Council. Thank you so much for providing the support. Please stay tuned. The College of Education and Integrative Studies will be having a part 2 conversation in terms of having some additional conversations around GIS, including how it sits at the intersection of critical race theory. Again, thank you, yes, we need it, thank you, I see you back there. So at your tables, you have the QR codes. Please stay in contact with us. And also, if you're seeking more information on when we're rolling these discussions out, please hit us up. Thank you so much. Take care.